OK 好 ，OK 大家好，歡迎大家社友同埋嘉賓咧，今日嚟到呢個現場咧參加我哋嘅演講會。咁我係今日嘅主持人Ada 湯梅姨，亦都係工商管理研究社嘅節目組主席。咁首先歡迎大家先。咁今日我哋參與嘅人士咧有嚟到現場嘅，亦都有啲朋友同埋社友咧係經過網上係經過 Zoom 嚟參加我哋呢一個演講會。咁咧就亦都係今日我哋會用 Facebook 直播嘅。今日我哋咧嘅演講題目咧就係美國大選後對全球嘅影響。好高興咧請到我哋都熟悉嘅我哋嘅社友譚安厚教授Hugh Thomas 咧同我哋做呢一個演講嘅。阿 Hugh 咧就係加拿大人，但係佢講係好流利嘅普通話同埋廣東話，咁所以咧一陣間嘅演講會咧，阿 Hugh 就選擇用英文嚟進行。咁我呢個開場白咧就係用廣東話嘅，咁阿 Hugh 完全明白晒嘅，冇問題嘅。OK， 咁同埋一陣間我哋有個演講會完咗之後咧，有個答問環節嘅。呢個答問環節你可以用中文，可以用英文，咁視乎阿 Hugh 咧中意用邊種語言嚟到同我哋作答，同我哋交流，咁都冇問題。咁我哋今日特別在咧，就係喺線上嘅朋友咧，可以用一個發問平台 Slido 將你嘅問題咧 post 上去。只要你喺嗰個 screen 嗰度咧，就 scan 咗嗰個 QR code，咁就可以將你嘅問題咧低落去，咁我哋就收到噶啦。而喺現場嘅朋友啊，當然隨時可以舉手發問啊，參與呢個討論咁樣啦。我哋今日個題目咧就係講個大選對於全球嘅影響啦。咁美國大選11月初已經完成，咁到現在咧，特朗普亦都係未正式承認輸咗嘅。但係亦都係但係佢俾聯邦總務處咧可以進行呢個權力交接儀式。咁我諗都係 kind of 佢都知道，即係應該係要退落嚟㗎啦。雖然佢係講緊仲會係進行呢個法律程序，係咪？咁所以咧就睇嚟佢嘅翻盤嘅機會好細啦。冇㗎啦，應該的咁多。好嘅，咁我哋都知道1月20號咧，應該白宮就會易主㗎啦，由呢個民主黨嚟到上場。咁好多分析都話喺特朗普咧喺餘下落嚟嗰2個月時間咧，會推出好多末期政策。咁呢啲政策就最多就係制裁中國啦，中國嘅企業啊，或者係中國共產黨嘅組織啊咁樣。咁佢又咁樣做，應該就係即係等阿拜登上場嘅時候，唔係咁容易改變即係佢 set 落嚟嘅政策，係咪咁樣？咁亦都喺呢個4年時間咧，特朗普亦都係退出咗好多國際組織嘅。咁所以當阿拜登上場嘅時候咧，實際上都面臨到好多問題。佢有國內嘅問題喺呢個疫情啊，同埋呢個經濟嘅衰退，亦都喺國際上面咧，可能佢要修補同一啲同盟友嘅關係。或者再檢視對華政策啊，咁樣好多嘢做。咁當然我哋亦都唔能夠話到佢上場嘅時候係完全唔同晒啦，同中國嘅政策冇可能啦，因為國策嚟㗎啦，都係要即係壓制中國嘅發展，係咪？咁所以咧喺呢個千變萬化嘅局面，香港又係會有受咩影響咧？同埋中美關係又會有個新個局面咧？咁所以咧，我哋今日好高興請到阿 Hugh 嚟呢度同我哋分享。我哋都好熟悉阿 Hugh，但係咧就想都係揾少少時間介紹下你嘅 background。咁阿 Hugh 係加拿大人啦，咁咧就係首先咧佢就喺加拿大嘅 University of Alberta 咧得到呢個歷史文學士學位。咁其後咧就係喺北京語言文化大學嘅漢語得到漢語言碩士學位，同埋呢個南京大學嘅歷史學碩士學位。接着咧就係得到中文大學嘅工商管理碩士學位。咁而喺1991年喺 New York
87年係離開香港，然後就91年就有嗰個學士。
好啊，
都係牛肉。
講得幾好。咁嗰一年咧，佢就喺New York University 嘅 Stern School of Business 咧，得到呢個 PhD in Finance 嘅。咁阿 Hill 咧，實際上就除咗呢啲學術成就之外咧，亦都做過好多嘅喺商界啦，喺學界都做到好多嘢。咁如果我一一介紹咧，就講完咧個 seminar 就完㗎。咁所以咧，我就唔一一介紹，只係講而家阿 Hill 咧就係喺香港中文大學深圳嘅學院經管學院裏面擔任finance 嘅副教授，亦都係有幾個 program 嘅 director 或者係 co-director 嘅。咁所以咧就我喺呢度唔一一介紹你嘅著作啊，同埋你做過嘅做過職位咁樣樣啦。咁好多謝，我將呢個時間交俾你啦，阿 Hill。咁你可以喺度講。
Thank you very much, Ado. And thank you, Chairman Jules, and thank you, members of CEC. It's a great honor to be speaking with you today about the global effect of the US elections. I have not researched this subject. I am not an international relations expert. So I know that many of you, both online and here, have done a lot of research on these topics. So please take my comments in the spirit of starting a discussion. I welcome your questions, complaints, amiable discussions afterwards. As a Canadian with a very proud ancestry in the United States, going back to the 17th century, as a person with a strong love for China, as a person who's done research into finance and innovation, I've been absolutely fascinated with US politics since 2015, and especially since last year, and even more so since November the 3rd. As you know, the United States has been broken into two different camps, if you like. This is in New York City, and I was talking with a colleague of mine just after the election, and people were literally dancing in the streets. He talked with his mother, he's at my age, he was talking with his mother, and she said she remembers Second World War, the last time that they danced in the streets, so full of energy for so long. This, of course, is Stop the Steal in Washington, D.C. These are Trump supporters also after the election. So clearly, there has been a certain amount of conflict in the United States. 可算尘埃落定. Finally, the dust has settled. And of course, this is the dust settler in chief, Emily Murphy, the director of GSA, who declared that she ascertained the high likelihood that Biden would become president, thereby releasing several $1 million, the daily presidential briefs, the access to the FBI so that the FBI could check his nominees for government posts, and the access to all government departments. A 100 years ago, my grandfather came back from the trenches, World War I, and he brought with him the Spanish flu. The whole family was exposed to it, and two of the members of the family were very sick with it. Nobody died. That was the end of the Great War. There had been revolution, and there was a break in 1920. And that break was a break in tradition, and it gave way then to the Roaring Twenties. This was a social change. I believe that we are right now seeing a tremendous social change. Now, of course, it's not quite the Roaring Twenties of back then, but I believe that what we're seeing is the end of Pax Americana, that is the end of the dominance of the world by the United States that has been there since 1945, and the end and the beginning of a release of a new set of energies. And we in Hong Kong are extremely well positioned to take advantage of it. What we're doing is we've crossed a tipping point. The tipping point, obviously, it's after a buildup of a lot of changes. History builds slowly, but perceptions of history change quickly. And I think that we've gone into a perceptual tipping point. America claims to be the best. It claims to be morally righteous. It claims to be governmentally democratic. It claims to be socially free, economically large, and militarily strong. It is no longer so. The perception of it is no longer so. The change has occurred over many years, but we have seen the turning point this month. I'd like to make a few comments about righteousness. This would be 正义 in Chinese. So there is a belief traditionally among Americans that they are morally righteous. And this comes from their history, because they were started by Protestants of various descriptions back in the 17th century when they immigrated, and they had extremely strong religious beliefs. When in the late 18th century, the American 13 colonies rebelled against the UK, against Britain as it was then, they still had strong religious beliefs in the various settlements, but the actual framers of the American Constitution were deist. They were not Christian in a traditional sense. They believed in God, but it wasn't a Christian God. You can see that on the Freemasonic symbols on many of the things that dated from that time. But they had this idea that God had shed its grace, his grace, on the United States, that everyone should believe in this destiny that they had, and they had that belief that the faith was plural. That is to say, everybody had their own faith, but that shouldn't interfere with the body politic. It shouldn't interfere with the way the government was being run. And there should be this division between religion and politics. Trump broke the tradition. He was the first person who had, first of all, no religious beliefs himself, no religious knowledge himself. Trump is unable to quote from the Bible. Trump was unable to worship in a ceremony. And yet, notwithstanding that background, he harnessed sectarian religious beliefs to drive his achievement of the presidency. He promised to clean out corruption in government, but he encouraged others to believe that government was corrupt. Because others believed that government was corrupt through his encouragement, then his corruption was reduced and justified as a means to fight the other's corruption. He justified his own corruption as toughness, and he demonized the press, demonized the light that is shone on government in order to ensure that it can continue to be clean. By these actions, he brought down the righteousness of the American system. Democracy. Joe Biden said 6 days ago, an incredibly damaging message is being sent to the rest of the world about how democracy functions. So what Joe Biden was revealing in those words was this idea that the United States is equivalent to democracy, which of course is foolish, but something that many, many Americans believe intrinsically, or at least have believed. It's foolish because democracy is ruling by the people. Now, everybody who sets up a system of government or who works in a system of government wishes that system of government to be in accord with the people. No system of government since ancient times has actually been true democracy where the people rule. There's always systems of representation, there's systems of periodic polling, there's systems of feedback, but there isn't pure democracy. Americans for a century have basked in the illusion that theirs is the only true democracy. Now, whether or not their true democracy was more democracy than this 民族集中制 that they have up north, I'm sure that you would think, well, probably it is more democratic than that one, but it is not pure democracy. Yet the Americans were able to righteously preach democracy to the rest of the world. In the last month, we've had an amazing spectacle of an American president who is actively saying that he is not running a democratic country. So the Americans claim to be how democracy functions has been shown to be an exaggeration at the very least. Freedom. Ask an American what is the best thing about America, and they're likely to say freedom. We are free, you are enslaved. At least that is the implication. Freedom for what? Freedom to believe, to express, to move, to associate, to resist authority, to bear arms, to revolt. We are free from, they will tell you, the tyranny. Tyranny of what? Tyranny of those in authority, but also the tyranny of experts. The tyranny, the pressure of science. What is going on here? The idea here is that my ideas, each individual's ideas, are as good as each other individual's ideas. It's as good as the experts. And so the extreme idea, expression of that idea, is that the experts have no right to interfere with my freedom. And that extreme comes out from time to time. The idea of freedom is extremely beautiful. I love nothing more than freedom. But a half of Americans say that they should be taught, as well as evolution, that they should also be taught creationalism. The idea that the world started about 10,000 years ago or less, and it was created immediately. Just under half of Americans say that they should be taught creationalism, but not evolution in the schools. So this is a denial of authority at a level that is almost unthinkable on this part of the world, on this side of the world. Freedom from science. And you all know what happened a year ago here in Hong Kong. I was horrified when I saw that among my students at CUHK in Shatin, they had written on the campus, 港独是唯一的出路, which was exactly the opposite from the truth, because one must look at what an effective route is, what a feasible route is. They chose an infeasible route and said it was the only feasible route. You can see that they were encouraged in that belief by the American ideal of freedom. A beautiful ideal, but it comes into conflict with reality. And when it does come into conflict with reality, reality wins. Wealth. China is the largest economy of the world. You don't just have to look at all the telephones and all of the airports and high-speed rail networks. You can look at the numbers. America is the second largest economy of the world. Now you'll say, well, in nominal US dollars, surely the United States at 20 trillion dollars is larger than the Chinese economy at 13 trillion. But the Chinese economy is half services and half goods. So if we say, well, services are basically paid for in wages. So if we take that half of the services economy, US $6.9 trillion, and if we increase it by 64%. Why 64%? Because that is the percentage that when you add those inflated services to the goods economy, also $6.9 trillion, you come exactly to the size of the American economy. And we all know that Chinese wages are not just, that American wages are not just 64% higher than Chinese wages, they are much higher than Chinese wages. So that tells us that, yes, the largest economy of the world is the Chinese economy. The World Bank said that the crossover occurred in 2017. These are purchasing power parity numbers. The World Bank used a much more complicated method to calculate purchasing power parity than I just did a few moments ago. But they came to the same conclusion. Obviously, the largest economy of the world is the Chinese. Strength. This is the flag of the United States of America. Don't tread on me. It was sketched out in 1775, an early revolutionary flag. The idea here is Americans do not want people to pick on them. And that then became the Gadsden flag. It's a rattlesnake. You tread on the rattlesnake bites you, you die. So that was an ideal in the United States. We don't want to attack others, but if you attack us, we will kill you. America has the biggest armed forces in the entire world. They have the ability to project lethal force to any corner of the world. However, they're a reluctant imperialist. They don't really want to spend the manpower and the money, spend the lives and the money to invade and hold other people's territory. What are they doing as the world's policemen? They've been the world's policemen since 1945. What they're doing, obviously, is they were provoked into it. That's how they see it. 1941, Pearl Harbor. 2001, 9/11, the two big provocations. Trump voiced a grudge against spending US strength and money to protecting others. Trump renounced building liberal democracies and embraced transaction-based foreign policy. He pledged to end endless wars. 19 years, 1 month, 2 weeks, and 4 days after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Americans are still in Afghanistan. Trump has, sorry. Trump has drawn down forces this month to 3,000 and 2,500 in Iraq and Afghanistan. That number is so low that it will be extremely difficult for anybody to build them back up again. And it's politically not possible for Biden to build them back up again. So the post-Trump changes should be understood through this inflection. America has retreated from leadership, and it has lost moral, political, social, economic, and military leadership. Trumpism will outlive Trump and contribute to this retreat. I'd like to tell a brief anecdote. 2 weeks ago, I was at a party in Yunlong. A Chinese American who was born in Hong Kong, who had US citizenship and who spent his time between San Francisco and Hong Kong, not a white guy, not an evangelical, not even a Christian, said when I asked him about the election that of course he supported Trump. Trump is strong, Biden's weak. Trump is a man's man, Biden is a woman's man. Trump likes free speech, Biden likes politically correct speech. Trump is tough, Biden is bureaucratic. Trump is a populist, Biden is an elitist. Trump has family values, Biden likes gays and lesbians. Trump is a capitalist, Biden is a communist. Now, you might not agree with what he said, but he certainly expressed that opinion. Trump should have won. It's true. Had there not been this, had there not been the pandemic, Trump would have won. Trump reflects at least a part of the soul of America. He didn't win because of this 250,000 lives that had been lost. He didn't expand his base because, well, he's ignorant, he's greedy, he's corrupt, and he's boorish. But he still would have won had it not been for this. 75 to 90% of Trump voters believe that he's lost due to voter fraud. And that means that there will be the myth growing up in American society, and it has two parts. One part is American democracy is either dead or has been completely taken over by people that are against it. The other part is the stab in the back theory that within the American body politic and also in the Republican Party itself, people have conspired against Trump. The page is turned, bringing a new administration. With that new administration, we in Hong Kong can heave somewhat of a sigh of relief because we will be getting respect for the rest of the world. And that means there'll be reduced political volatility. From the United Nations point of view, it means that there'll be respect for the United Nations. The United States has never fully respected the United Nations, but people within the United States have respected it. And among them are people like Joe Biden. That probably means that the $1.3 billion of overdue bills that the US owes to the United Nations will be repaid. And it means that there'll be some support for the rebalancing of power within the United Nations, which, as you know, is quite outdated. The WTO. There'll probably be a more serious use of resolution panels within the United States to address international grievances in trade. There certainly will be support for appointment of judges, which during Trump were not appointed at all, leading to a breakdown in the resolution panels. And there will be a foregoing of bilateralism, the kind of thing that led to the China trade war, the China-US trade war. There'll be a foregoing of bilateralism in support of multilateralism of the WTO. The WHO, the United States will rejoin it. There's going to be an attempt then to align national US health policies with that of the rest of the world. It'll be an honest attempt. It'll be for the good of the world. The Paris Climate Accord, there'll be a rejoining of the Paris Climate Accord and a targeting of zero carbon emissions probably by the middle of the century. And there will be a paying attention to and a respecting of traditional allies of the United States. But the US will not regain free trade initiatives. The TPP, which would have been signed into law had Hillary won back in 2016, is probably not going to be revived. And the reason why is that Trump's ideas of fair trade have now taken over the American consciousness from the idea of free trade. Democrats have never been the party of free trade. That was the Republicans' ticket. Why the Democrats managed to morph into the party of free trade, I do not quite understand. But the fact is that Biden is basically a traditional Democrat. The TPP is not exactly politically a win for Biden. It is not because his base does not believe in free trade. Moreover, we've just seen in the last month the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership signed. This is the largest trade group in the entire history of the entire world, and it came into force, not into force, it came to be signed just this last month. It's an ASEAN initiative, but the Chinese were invited in, as were the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Australians and the New Zealanders. So if it's ratified, it'll become this huge trading bloc of free trade. Now, the amount of tariffs that are actually being reduced are not that great. The most important thing about this trading bloc is that it will be an ongoing club. And the members of that club are devoted to economic cooperation. Remember the European coal and steel community of 1952. That became the EU. These are the members. That's who it is. The free trade area that now is going to be dominated by China, not because China set it up, but because ASEAN set it up and invited China in. And there's only 2 spots that are surrounded by everybody else. And of course, that's North Korea and Taiwan. And it's not completely beyond the possibility that one or both of them will finally join. After all, it's trade. It's just business. There's hope for the Iran nuclear deal. The US sanctions didn't work particularly well. They separated the US from the Europeans. However, there isn't the moral, political, social, economic, and military leadership that the US had 4 years ago now. And that means that the Americans are not likely to be able to reimpose control over the Iranian nuclear ambitions. And North Korea has demonstrated to the world that having nuclear weapons is useful in international relations. The US love for China is lost and gone. 25% of Americans see China as that's the THE enemy in the world. This is even worse. 77% of Americans see the Chinese as an enemy. 10% don't know. So there has been an inflection, a change in the perception of Americans when they look at the Chinese. Just under half of Americans think that COVID-19 was invented and produced in a Chinese lab. American residents who I've met over the last year I haven't found one person among those American residents who I've met over the last year that believes that China has not become number one by stealing US intellectual property, by cheating at trade, and by engaging in unfair competition. Whether or not any of those accusations are true is less important to the Chinese-American body politic relations than the fact that they believe it. So Americans' love affair with China is over. I can remember how good it was when it was. I went with my wife to the United States. I'm going to have to turn this thing off. I went with my wife to the United States as a student in 1987 to do my PhD. And at that time, the Americans loved the Chinese. Whether or not, 不管你想当游客、当移民、当海归都没关系，都受欢迎。That was a beautiful feeling that we had going to the United States in those good years. That's not coming back. Americans now see China as the alien force challenging American values and prosperity. And the reason's obvious. Americans know America is no longer number one. American values are no longer righteous. So our hope in going forward is this hope of a shared humanity. It's this hope that the wheels of commerce, driven by the Chinese and indeed the world boom, will continue to drive us together because commerce does that. And our hope that the magnet that people perceive in the Chinese attraction of this increasingly strong and, yes, innovative country will attract the next generation all over the world. They'll go to China and they will be attracted by it. This is sort of the TikTok generation, if you like. People that see China as attractive for itself. We haven't had a sovereign debt crisis for about 20 years. I mean, we've had little sovereign. Oops. Sorry, I popped forward in that. Make it backwards. Right. China-Biden initiatives. Okay, so this looks at the relationship between China and the United States. I think what you'll see is biting words, but no fatal actions. And by that, the biting words, Chinese re-education of Uyghurs, there'll be a hardened US criticism. Trump basically didn't criticize it very much. The Afghanistan war that the United States was involved in, but will be leaving very shortly, made a natural ally of the US and China suppressing the East Turkestan Islamic movement. That natural ally is now gone, or will be gone as soon as the United States leaves Afghanistan. And then the United States can assert their natural righteousness to criticize the cultural assimilation that the Chinese are perpetrating within East Turkestan, within Xinjiang. Hong Kong, there is a narrative about Democrats versus Beijing hardliners. And I think we've got a room full of Beijing hardliners here in that narrative. I'd be part of the Beijing hardliners too, although if you'd told me 30 years ago that I was going to be in this camp as described by the Western media narrative, I would not have believed you. There will be, under Biden, hardened support for Democrats against Beijing hardliners. You probably noticed that Trump has dropped the words one China policy from treatment of Taiwan. There is no political capital for Biden in reimposing on the American body politic the one China policy. And of course, there'll be warship-free passage continuing. However, the shows of force, one would hope, under this less volatile regime, will be forewarned and carefully implemented, because nobody wants to get involved in a war. So we hope that there'll be fruits of multilateralism and calm. This will be partly caused by the end of foreign policy by Twitter. There will be a continued anti-Huawei campaign. Anything that touches on national security in the United States will be fair game for anti-China policies. And you can see why this happens. Snowden, when he was uncovered in 2013, that was basically done by American espionage work in the internet space. The Americans do it, and they're pretty sure that the Chinese either are doing it or would do it. And of course, national security, if it came to it, would dominate a corporate incentive for gain. So the anti-Huawei campaign will continue. Personally, I hope that Meng Wanzhou will be, that extradition request will be dropped. She's now been sitting in Vancouver for 2 years under house arrest. It's a trumped up case, and hopefully under Biden, it will be trumped down. The Americans will say to the Canadians, just release her. The Canadians will release her, and you'll have a reduction of tension on that. And I think that TikTok will be allowed to continue. Sorry, this is the slide that I thought that I was going to a moment ago. We haven't had a sovereign debt crisis or a set of real cascading sovereign debt crises for 20 years. This is the number of sovereign defaults per year since 1959 to the present day. And as you can see, this was the real peak back in the early 80s. I personally think that we're heading into another peak. The reason why I think so is because COVID-19 will have tremendous strains on certain economies, as will the continuing volatility and low prices in the commodity markets. So in that, there will be a change in power. The Americans will no longer be the main seats at the table in the sovereign debt crisis negotiations. This is Chinese government debt for the DSSI eligible countries. So this is for countries that are likely to have relief when they go into default. Those are the countries. There's almost certainly going to be some kind of a set of sovereign debt crises, and China will be the main negotiator in this. But the real question is what happens to the US dollar-centered global financial system? And the reason why this is the real question is because no global financial system has ever survived forever, right? So we know that we don't deal in Spanish dollars anymore. We know that we don't deal internationally in Great Britain pounds anymore. We know that at some time in the future, we will not use the American dollar as the international currency of exchange. However, we do now. It was set up in Bretton Woods following 1945, and it was that was a fixed exchange rate system, and it was revived into a floating exchange rate system in the mid-1970s. And it's basically the system that has continued down to the present. However, remember when Trump was elected, he was elected to make America great again. Now, the biggest thing that he was supposed to do in making America great again was in changing this balance of payments, this current account deficit. And in 2020, basically the same place as we were in 2016. There is still a balance of payment deficit in in the United States, and a balance of payment surplus in China. And it's sustainable as long as Chinese are happy purchasing American assets, and Americans are happy selling their assets to the Chinese. In the long run, it's unsustainable because there'll be at some point a tiring of this, but in the short run, it is unassailable. By that, I mean that it's just the way the world operates. And the Chinese are happy to accumulate foreign assets, and the Americans are happy to issue those assets. The question then leaps to mind, when does the short term become the long term? This is the other deficit, and it's the fiscal deficit of the United States. And here we are in the pandemic, and strangely, as a percentage of GDP in the United States, this year, 2020, was the year that the government debt crossed the debt that was generated by World War II. So almost certainly under Biden, there will be a large fiscal stimulus program that's going to be coming out to help the United States deal with the pandemic. What were numbers that were projected by the US government before it was clear that there was going to be such a massive stimulus program, because this was before the recent spike in the pandemic. So almost certainly, the US debt will follow a trajectory like that, which is fine. In the long run, it's unsustainable. In the short run, it's unassailable. When does the short run become the long run? This is what's happened to the foreign exchange rate since the beginning of this year. The renminbi is up 7%. Is it going to continue? I'm not sure. Breaks in the foreign exchange rate happen when there are losses of confidence. The US Fed, the Federal Reserve in the United States, the central bank in the United States, is absolutely incapable of stopping a run on the US dollar. Why? Because at $140 billion of foreign exchange reserves, they have the 20th largest foreign exchange reserves in the world. They have 50% more than Canada, but less than Poland, the Czech Republic, Israel, Russia, Mexico, or Italy. They have pathetic foreign exchange reserves. Why? Because they don't need them. Why don't they need them? Because the US currency is the reserve currency of the world. They're printing the money. They can continue to print the money as long as the people on the other side of the world are happy to take it. The foreign exchange market is US dollars 6.6 trillion turnover per day. So US foreign exchange reserves are 2% of daily turnover. So clearly, if there was ever an attack on the US dollar by the foreign exchange markets, and the 20 countries with more foreign exchange reserves than the US didn't step in, then this would be a problem. Of course, as long as they want to step in, they can step in. Why can they step in? Because they would be using their own currency to purchase US dollars. So these friends of the dollar are the best friends that the dollar could have. These are the central bankers of the world who do not want to see on their watch their KPI, their key performance indicator, go negative. Central bankers like making money too. So they would not want to have the US dollar, after all, their largest reserve asset, depreciate on their watch. So what we see is kind of a jerky down escalator, because these people, these are the percentage of reserve currencies held by the foreign exchange, by the central banks of the world. Okay, so adding together, the US dollar is 60% of foreign exchange reserves worldwide. And it's gone down over the last 4 years that Trump has been in power by 2%. The biggest increaser, Chinese renminbi, up by 22% as a proportion of total reserves. So we have this jerky escalator. The people that are on the escalator, or the ones with most control over the escalator, the central bankers, don't want to see it going down as soon as but they don't want to have so much US dollars on their balance sheet, the US Treasury securities on their balance sheet. So it starts going down and then they stop. It starts going down and then they stop. So there could be a major loss of confidence. And then the question is, what would be the alternative currency? The renminbi could become the world's next reserve currency, but would probably do so later rather than sooner. And the reason why, one of the reasons, is that that crisis that comes from increased volatility has disappeared. He's been elected out of office. Joe Biden, increased fiscal responsibility, increased multilateralism, decreased volatility, has joined as the leader of the United States. The People's Bank of China is not keen on internationalization. Why? Because they're scared. Why are they scared? Because they don't really want their people to have the option to join a run on the currency. And if the renminbi was internationalized on capital account, there would always be that option for the holders of renminbi to run on the currency. And that risk is a risk that the People's Bank of China does not wish to take at this point. Maybe they'll become more keen to take that risk in the future, but we don't know. When World War II financial order crumbled back in the mid-70s, the world, though, was basically closed on capital account. The world could, in a crisis, also close back on capital account, and then you could have the renminbi becoming more viable as an international currency. But there's something else that's happening, and this is an international currency that is retail, and it's retail and available in the hands of every one of us. What is it? It's a digital currency, electronic payment, basically Bitcoin, that is controlled by the central bank. And it's been in tests in China for the last few months. The Chinese central bank, People's Bank of China, set up these tests. Why? Because they were afraid of Facebook's Libra. Facebook was going to start this international currency. They had a big hoo-ha about it about 2 years ago, and People's Bank of China said we should be in on that as well. So it's useful to think about the forms of money. G is right in the middle. What is G? Widely accessible, digital, central bank issued token-based currency. There's nothing technically that makes it impossible to issue. This is what the Central Bank of China is going to be, or is issuing now in certain test areas. It has the advantage that it's centrally controlled. It has the advantage that it's in everybody's wallet and could be used. You could have a lid on it in terms of the value of any given transaction. So it could be held to retail and then expanded beyond retail. It can be held to people within a certain area and then expanded beyond the people in a certain area. This is the, you might have seen this before, the money flower. So all forms of money can be described as places within the money flower. These are widely accessible money systems. These are central bank issued money. This is digital money, and this is token-based money. And then right in the middle is widely accessible digital central bank money. So if the renminbi replaces the US dollar as an international currency, one could see it coming in gradually from the retail, gradually from the domestic. And I think that that's the more likely path in the Biden years. And so we embark on a steady path into the new world. It's better than the alternative. That's all I wanted to say. So if anybody has questions, comments, criticisms, contributions, discussions with respect to anything that I've said, then please join me.
What's up with you?
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so I already got some questions online, and so maybe you can take take a drink.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I need to.
Did I go over time?
It's okay. It's okay. It's only 1 hour. It's good.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay. Good. Fine. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. So I also need to take some time to because we got some questions.
Please. Yes.
And then I want to review it before I give you the question. Okay. You just said that, Hugh, you just said that in Biden's era, maybe there may be only biting words, but no fatal action. So,
希望.
希望, hope. Okay. So,
I think that nobody is in his administration is keen to go to war.
Mhm.
And I think that in China, no one's keen to go to war.
Yeah, good. And but there's a question from the online is quite similar to my own questions. Do you think that there will be a slowdown or even a halt of the China-U.S. trade war?
Well, I think there'll be a
slowdown, in the Biden government.
Right. So the trade war is bilateral. The trade war is bilateral. What Biden is keen to pursue is multilateralism. Okay. So this idea that one should pursue fair trade by attacking the exports of the party that we believe is unfair, I don't think is something that Biden subscribes to. So he'd much rather have a multilateral approach to China.
Mm-hmm.
And so then what does he wish to get from the Chinese? Well, presumably he wishes to get better protection of IP, intellectual property, less subsidies for state-owned enterprise, greater access to the Chinese market.
Okay.
That is consistent with WTO objectives, and he can pursue it in a multilateral basis. Will he step back from the tariffs that have already been applied? That's the question. Because I don't think that he can do it without getting something in return. So the question is how that dance goes ahead.
Okay.
Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. But at least Biden is more predictable.
Absolutely.
More rational.
And I think that Trump has his own rationality, but you're right that Trump comes across as being highly unpredictable, and Biden is committed to the global structures that the Americans built.
Yeah.
Right, and so he's likely to work through them.
So anyway, more predictable is good for us.
I hope so. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So any question from the guests here? So we can just give you a microphone. You mic 㗎？唔使㗎。
頭先我用中文得啦嚇 ，OK 頭先阿 Hugh 講過啦，就係如果拜登上就係傾向於多邊主義咁而如果多邊主義之下咧，其實就有人咁講嘅，咁拜登上場之後喺而家嘅走勢咧係全球可能分咗兩個陣營嘅，咁就即係美國其實一直都同一啲所謂西方國家啦。咁可能係一個陣線嘅，而一啲所謂相對一個中國，可能而家講緊佢一帶一路去行一個佢自己嘅一個所謂嘅盟友，去尋找佢自己嘅盟友啦。咁無論喺個地緣政治方面，可能走向於兩極化，即係分咗兩邊陣營啦。甚至乎喺其他方面，譬如科技化等等嘅，亦都可能分咗兩方面嘅陣營嘅。咁你覺得呢個睇法會唔會真係有可能出現咧？
我自己覺得唔會有兩個 不可能是两边的，不可能真正的范围两个不同的，因为你就看那个 RCEP 就那个共同体包括日本、南朝鲜、那个中国，那么阿联那些国家，那个10国家，澳大利亚、新西兰。那么如果他们在一边，那么从一个国防的观点来讲，当然澳大利亚、新西兰、那个南朝鲜，日本在美国那边。那么 I think that the world will, I think that the attraction of the world and in order to trade and to pass data and to develop technologies is too attractive. And so from a defense point of view, yes, it breaks. Perhaps from a point of view of data, perhaps from a point of view of the free passage of data, it breaks. But I don't think that the world is going to cleave the way it did under the Soviets during the Cold War into two parts, because it's too fragmented already. And China is integrated into the world through its trade, but also through its investments. It's one of the largest FDI investors. And it's being welcomed. Its funds are being welcomed overseas. It invests in less developed countries. It tries to invest in the United States. Maybe it won't be able to invest in high-tech enterprises in the United States, but it's still going to be investing in FDI in the United States in low-tech enterprises. So I think that there's not going to be that cleaving. 除非有战争，那么一有战争 that's it. All bets are off. 但是我认为那个战争的可能性是相当小，而且那个最近几天那个可能性就减少了。
Okay, actually, I've seen some questions in the from the online guests, and there are quite a lot of people are concerned about Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are quite two questions are quite similar. Maybe I just combine them. And one question is, will Hong Kong be benefit under a Biden government? And another question is, put it in Cantonese.
Yeah.
And 佢話因為香港去年因為修例個風波咧，就係爆發咗示威浪潮啦。咁嗰陣時嘅美國總統Trump 咧多次批評中國嘅手法，即係香港嘅處理手法。咁咧就佢哋得到好多香港示威者嘅即係認同支持咁樣啦。咁而家拜登當選咧，咁會唔會話令到美國政府對中國同香港嘅政策有咩改變？佢哋會唔會唔用Trump 咁強硬嘅手法？咁會唔會拜登有啲乜嘢唔同？
你講手法，其實個係講法，唔係手法。主要嘅係梗係有啲手法，但係主要係講嘅。我諗那個Biden會更嚴肅。
係啊，因為喺奧巴馬政府嘅時候，實際上唔止係喺經濟上面制裁，實際上喺 politically 係更加嚴肅嘅。係啊，所以你覺得唔會改變嘅？
唔會改變。
會唔會更強烈咧？
手段可能係
唔同，即係手段就比較
穩妥嘅，
比較穩妥，比較圓滑。
但係個講嘅肯定係咁嚴肅，
一定係嘅。
係啦，因為 because Biden believes in the American righteousness.
Yeah.
Trump never believed in that.
Yeah, he's more in the business side.
He's a businessman. You only look at the immediate gain from an interaction.
Okay. 咁香港又會唔會有啲乜嘢得着咧？如果拜登當選， 因為我諗呢個題目咧係比較問經濟上邊嘅，可能係。咁我哋因為我哋啲舍友咧好多都係做出口啦，做廠啦。咁我哋喺幾個月前，實際上特朗普政府就宣布唔可以再用 Made in Hong Kong 呢個 label 噶嘛。呢個我哋實在好 proud 噶嘛，或者 consumer 揸住嗰個 product 見到 Made in Hong Kong 都有啲 excited 嘅。咁啊，而家唔可以用啦，啲 Made in Hong Kong 都係要 Made in China，好似唔需要有個 extra duty 嘅，要 Made in Hong Kong。即係 according what I learned。
Yes, I did.
咁會唔會呢個又有啲咩轉變？會唔會睇到咧？呢啲比較可能細緻啲。
係啦，I think that there will not be any change that will let people think that Biden is soft on China.
OK。
咁77%人覺得而家中國係大人，敵人。Right? Again, so if China's the enemy, then nothing that you can do to help China is going to help you politically in the United States, unless there's a change in people's attitudes. 咁我覺得 people 嘅睇法係慢慢改變嘅，係唔會即刻就改。希望77%係最高嘅。I think that when people realize that China is a reasonable actor on the world stage, and people calm down, then it'll come down from that peak. But right now,
即係你覺得唔會嘅，
唔會嘅，真係唔會嘅，
一樣唔會手軟嘅，只不過比較 rational 啲，講起上嚟就可能唔係咁瘋狂。係啦，可能用字唔係咁瘋狂。係啦，但一樣會一
樣係好嚴肅。
好嚴肅 ，OK，thank you。咁啊，仲有問題喎？個問題我又想問下咧，as you said, Joe Biden may not be interested in rejoining international free trade organization, but he already nominated John Kerry as the envoy, the special weather envoy, and then we joined the Paris climate accord. So seems it is quite a top priority on his desk.
Paris,
any indication?
Yes. Paris climate, definitely. Paris climate.
It's not only climate, I guess.
Well, I think that TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think its time has passed. You have to get those trade deals through Congress. Is it worth his political capital to get it through Congress? 那么任何时候要参加这些贸易区，肯定要經過你嘅國會嚇，國會唔通過，你冇得講。咁佢而家係國會冇乜嘢必要there's no need to push through a free trade agreement. It's not an emergency. People don't see it as helping. So why would he spend his political capital? With respect to the Paris Accord, it's different. Because in his own party, the left of his own party, and in fact the mainstream of his own party, think that the world is under threat. And so he helps his own standing by getting back into the Paris Accord. And he believes it himself.
Do you think it's also kind of a national security, kind of a climate?
Well, the climate accord, I think that calling it a national security effort is true in the long term, but not in the short term, right? I mean, clearly, if the oceans rise by, half a meter, then a large part of Florida disappears.
Yeah.
So that is the national security issue.
Okay.
But it's not this year's national security issue.
Okay. So another question from online audience. 美國嘅收入咧唔平等呢個問題咧，而家係處於50年嚟最嚴重嘅時期。係拜登喺呢個競選嘅時候咧，提出咧推倒部分特朗普喺2017年簽署嘅實行嘅稅務寬減措施。咁啊，其中包括咧將企業所得嘅稅率咧係從21% 咧就加到28%。咁咧就而家美國處於唔穩定嘅狀態，你覺得拜登係仲係會保持呢個承諾咧，就係即係推進加稅嘅計劃咧？
我諗對公司加稅係一定要推，因為佢自己嘅 base 係要咁做啊。對人嘅所得稅喺那個中間middle class, he will not raise taxes for middle class, but he will raise taxes at the top end. He must do that.
OK， 咁佢都守諾言喎。
應該會。
OK。
公司 and he must do it for the corporations, not a lot, but enough to say that he's done it.
And 有一個現場嘅朋友有問題。
喂，係 Thomas 啊，首先好多謝你，我見到你用咗好多功夫去講解嗰個內容，包括咗由經濟啊，或者係啲culture嗰方面去睇。不過我頭先睇到嗰個問題咧都幾嚴重，原來有77%嘅美國人咧認為中國係敵人。其實咁嘅情況之下咧，去到會唔會80%-90%咧，就差唔多要去到做一個戰爭嘅方法去解決呢個問題。咁第一樣嘢，咁第二樣嘢就係話，拜登除咗用經濟嗰方面令到國家更加穩定，佢會唔會用咩方法去令到？因為始終第一同第二，即係我指美國同中國呢兩個關係咧，如果唔能夠令到國民或者成個美國政府唔當中國係一個敵人咧，係好大危機㗎。對於我哋呢兩個國家嘅人民，甚至乎對於成個世界嚟講，因為呢個世界唔和平咧，咩貿易都唔使傾㗎啦。即係你個睇法係拜登去會唔會有啲方法令到呢件事，令到啲美國人民將一個憎恨嗰個程度咧去減低，定係佢都冇辦法？因為而家美國人真係咁憎中國啦，咁只能夠拖住去搞喺嚟緊呢4年裏面。呢個我一個提問嚟嘅，係唔該晒你。
First of all, I entirely agree with what you're saying, that it is a terrible risk. There's a terrible danger there when a whole people believe that another people are their enemy. I'm not sure that they believe that Chinese as a people are their enemy. I believe that they believe that China is the enemy. So that is less severe than believing that Chinese are the enemy. But I agree that they are conflated. I don't think that the number is going to go up more. I think that it went up partly because of the extreme language of the previous administration. And I believe that Biden himself doesn't want to continue that extreme language. So I hope that it will start dropping. But I entirely sympathize with what you're saying, that it is a real danger. 那么我自己来这边的是76年，那个时候76年来第一次来中国。那个时候我估计，那个时候70%多美国人的70%多都认为中国是敌人，中国是敌人。So in my lifetime, and in my time that I've been associated with China, that number has dropped from probably over 70% to well under 50%. And now it's swooped up again. I hope that it'll do it again. I think the way that it goes down is through people talking with people, increased communication. And I hope that that's part of the policies that Biden will pursue. But he cannot push against that perception directly. Because if he pushes against that perception directly, he undercuts himself politically. 居然70%多人认为中国是敌人，那一说，哎，不是，他们是朋友。Everybody will think he's soft on China. He'll lose his base. But I think he's an internationalist, and I think he will try to push towards internationalism.
So we can still go into traveling to US.
Oh, absolutely. It's a great country.
Yes, of course.
I think it's a tremendous place. I love it.
After the pandemic.
Well, yes, this is true. After the pandemic, this is true.
Yeah.
I didn't mention the pandemic at all because I think that give or take a half a year, it's over.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you've got 3 vaccines in the United States, you've got 1 in the UK, you've got 1 in Russia, and you've got probably a couple in China.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in a half a year, we'll all be fine.
Half a year means Easter.
This is it. 復活啦，
復活啦，復活節復活啦，
係啦
OK，係有朋友仲有問題係咪？
唔係我頭先所講啦，其實唔知係咪個 joke 啦嚇。我諗令到美國人唔好咁憎中國人啦。Is it possible that we provide more good food to American?
Good food must be a good price.
Just as Japanese 啦，我哋香港人好中意日本咧，就因為啲嘢好食、好過癮、好 fresh。咁如果我哋用我哋啲美食文化咧，我唔知中國政府點樣去做咧，令到佢哋通過溝通、通過食物，佢又幾好食喎啲嘢，又幾中意食佢啲嘢，慢慢俾啲好感佢咯。
係咪食物外交啊？係咪
啊？
係啦，
唔係乒乓外交，係食物外交。
如果咁容易就真係好容易咯。
真係。If you're around a round table, it's very difficult to argue. It's better to drink and eat.
Yeah,
absolutely.
唔得閒講。
其實啱啱講緊個題目就係話嗰個美國人好多係視中國為敵人。咁其實喺拜登佢之前其實都講緊嘢，就係佢最大嘅敵人唔係中國，係俄羅斯。咁會唔會佢上場之後，其實係將個重心轉移咗，係多咗去 against Russia， 而令到嗰個嘅 effect 冇咁大。點解近排咁多人即係美國人咁多人憎中國人咧？其實可能就因為特朗普嘅影響，佢一直都係將佢標揾咗出嚟。咁呢個勢頭會唔會轉咧？我覺得可能會咁轉法嘅。我唔知你認唔認同啊？
我認同。第一個係Trump 就係覺得中國當敵人係最有着手。另外，中國的確而家係世界最大嘅最強嘅國家，
國力最大。
就係從經濟觀念嚟講，啱啱講噶啦。It's the largest economy in the world, and it's rapidly growing. Russia isn't that way. It's basically stable, growing slightly. So there's a challenge that the Chinese are making towards the Americans, and it's the challenge to be number one. And that won't go away. So it's kind of sad. I mean, if you're an American, it's kind of sad. If you're a Chinese, it's kind of great. But anybody who wishes to politicize that can do so. So 我覺得下個election 都可能 they'll do it again. So Biden is perceived as the friend of China at his political peril. 所以佢嚟講係危險嘅。But it's not an enemy of the Chinese people. It's an enemy of the Chinese state, right? And it's certainly not an enemy of Chinese food.
Okay. And okay, here there's another question regarding finance. And the question is, what is the prospect of currency value in the US and rest of the world? Because we anticipate the new administration has their plan of remedy amounted to 2.2 trillion. So what?
Absolutely. So there is a fiscal stimulus. The fiscal stimulus will be to some extent monetized. That monetizing of the fiscal stimulus will lead to the drop in the US dollar.
Mhm.
Unless those close friends of the United States, the central bankers of the world, prop up the US dollar. And we know that they'll want to do that because they don't want to lose money on their watch. So as long as it's done slowly and with international cooperation, you'll have this escalator, this jerky escalator phenomenon.
So we don't keep much Hong Kong dollar.
Well, yes, the Hong Kong dollar is tied to the US dollar and will be so unless there's a real crisis. The moment that there's a real crisis, then it flips over to be tied to the renminbi. And it would flip in the matter of weeks or days.
現場嘅朋友有冇再有問題？咁我哋嘅網上嘅問題都差唔多啦。係啊，咁好多謝Hugh Thomas 同我哋進行呢一個演講會。咁而家我哋都有一個儀式咧，就係我哋嘅主席咧，胡佩康先生咧會致送紀念品。
多謝各位。
好啊，我都寫埋嚟。咁我哋嘅演講會就完結啦。多謝各位。